I get into some specific projects, starting with the BRCA challenge, John Byrne, who's always on time. I'm going to sit down and relax.
Thank you, Mark. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. That's who I am, and those are my disclosures at the bottom, one of which is relevant, my advice to AstraZeneca, which I'll mention later. So I thought I'd start with this painting from the wall of the Broad Institute. I don't have time to identify all members of the steering committee here, and in fact Queen Catherine of Melbourne wasn't actually at the original landing, but I did actually see Archbishop Bob Roy just in the background there. This artistic impression doesn't quite give credit to the Aboriginal geneticists who I represent, who are seen disappearing into the trees. Because actually this sort of is a deliberate joke, obviously. In fact, many geneticists do embrace genomics, and it's worth remembering that here in Leiden, Maya Linkreek was actually the first volunteer after Craig Venter and Jim Watson to have her whole genome sequenced in Johan den Dunnen's laboratory in their spare time for a mere 45,000 euros is what Jan told me he charged for it. And so, in fact, the geneticists have been very enthusiastic about this whole revolution. It should be said that, and like you and I love all Americans too, but they were a little bit disparaging about this, having been the third attempt to do a whole genome sequence on a named individual. But the Australian newspapers, I thought, caught the moment when they said man takes one step towards understanding woman. And as Ewan has already suggested, it's a bit of a long journey yet to take. So this is Jim Watson, you all know and love him, and he had his whole genome analysed by Baylor, and he is in fact our patron at the Centre for Life in Newcastle and visits us regularly. And I don't need to tell this audience the vast number of variants. None of them actually has identified the tendency to put your foot in your mouth when talking to journalists, which is possibly an acquired trait. But the important feature of this slide is not lost on you. We have 3 million variants each. This is a big problem, and we've really got to put together the people who can actually pull it into being. So when we were sitting last year at the meeting in the Wellcome Trust, I somewhat sort of thoughtlessly said, well, why don't we do BRCA? Because it's an obvious problem for those of us working in clinical practice. And it caught fire, and Stephen Chanik and Heidi Ream and others were rapidly drafted into the exercise. And so the BRCA Challenge became one of the vanguard projects of the Global Alliance, and I'm very pleased about that. One of the reasons I suggested it was, of course, because I was there wearing my hat as the co-chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the Human Variome Project. All good ideas had been thought of before, and Dick Cotton, a decade ago, pulled together a group of geneticists at the International Congress in Brisbane and said, why don't we try to pool all our data from all our variant databases on things like the CFTR database that Gary Cutting runs for cystic fibrosis. And this was when we kind of reached a peak in 2012 when we'd been promised a very substantial investment from the Chinese government that sadly fell foul of the electoral complexities of China, and so the money didn't happen. But I'm pleased to say that in fact the Chinese government have now come back to the table and have just this last week money arrived in the bank account of the Human Variome Project to support this effort. I also put this picture up for a sad reason, and there's Dick Cotton sitting at the front there, proudly in front of all of those members. Yesterday I heard that Dick had had a stroke, and he's currently in Melbourne Hospital in the high dependency unit, so I'm sure all our thoughts go out to him and his family and hope that he makes a speedy recovery. So I was very keen that we didn't lose all of this legacy in the enthusiasm of the novelty of the Global Alliance. And in fact, one of the ongoing projects for me and for many other people in the room is to bring together these two concepts of novelty with legacy. And I'll end with that in a moment. And in fact, tomorrow I'll fly to Paris because thanks to a grant from AstraZeneca, who have now produced the world's first commercial PARP inhibitor, which specifically works in BRCA1 and BRCA2 deficient cancer. And so it's a very exciting milestone in therapeutics. And they gave us a grant to actually have a meeting at UNESCO under the aegis of the Human Variome Project, because it is an incorporated organisation and is a recognised NGO of the Human Variome of UNESCO, and is very close to having NGO status with the World Health Organization. So I think those are two assets that the Human Variome Project brings to this table. Now, here's one we prepared earlier, and this is a rather busy slide, just to give credit to Mandy Spurdle in particular and Bryony Thompson, who for several years now have been pulling together a variant interpretation committee for the mismatch repair genes, and I had the pleasure to help create this organisation. The International Society for Gastrointestinal Hereditary Tumours was formally put together in 2003, and we brought together all of those individuals like Päivi Peltomäki and Mike Woods in Finland and Newfoundland respectively, who were labouring away individually and collecting data on variants in the mismatch repair genes. And together with Rolf Simons and Robert Hofstra here in the Netherlands, we put together the INSIGHT database. And those of you who are in clinical practice will be familiar with this. It receives thousands of hits every month now from clinical geneticists and molecular geneticists. It's hosted here in Leiden by the Leiden Open Variant Database run by Johan Den Dunnen. And this is a working example of what we need to achieve across the whole genome. So what we set out to do with BRCA has actually already been done with the mismatch repair genes. But of course now we can bring to the table all that variome data in addition to this sort of clinical reports that this is reliant on. So BRCA1 and BRCA2, I don't need to introduce to you. In fact, I don't need to introduce these two genes to anybody. I can talk about them in the pub. Everybody's heard of these two genes, and that's the key point. They're actually not ideal genes if you approach it from the bioinformatic perspective. They are relatively big genes. They cover a footprint of about 15,000 kb. So 1500 kb. So they are big genes with a lot of variation, and what that means is that they're actually quite hard to handle from an informatics point of view. There's a lot of noise out there to separate from the signal. And Heidi Ream, who is now, I'm pleased to hear, on the steering committee, put together this lovely analysis of the data from the BIC database, which Larry Brody founded back in the 90s and which is now fed into ClinVar and ClinGen. On the one side, LOVD databases created here in the Open Variant Database under Johan, and the UMD database, a very powerful database set up in Paris. And the point is that those three circles don't overlap. Now, this is actually just a fraction of the data that we have, and even this fraction doesn't overlap. And that's really not very good. And I'll show you a further example of that lack of overlap at the end of a clinical example. So what Stephen Shannock and I set out to do was create the sort of the go-to list of people who you could not deny this was the everybody and anybody of BRCA, because Stephen and I actually know nothing about the subject, which is why we were selected to lead it. And all of these people here actually do know a lot about this subject, and we probably haven't got all of them, but we've got enough people from around the world to say this will be the definitive BRCA database. It will not be one of the BRCA databases. That was the key point that we wanted to achieve. And so again, adapting one of Heidi's wonderful PowerPoint creations, I've actually seen her making these while buying coffee at the American Society. I mean, she does it all the time. So I've slimmed it down a bit. But the key point is federation of databases. We can't actually get all this into one place, nor do we need to, as long as the databases talk to each other. So ClinVar, EBI, LOVD would be the obvious sort of home bases. We still haven't worked out the detail of this yet, but as long as they are sharing information, that's the important thing. And of course, there's lots of information like BIC and HGMD already out there that we need to get together. But under the water, we need a curation system. And the good thing is we've actually got the basis for this, because Enigma is a well-established academic group which is led by Mandy Spurdle and David Golgar and others. And in fact, they are, as we speak, meeting in Portugal in their annual meeting. And also SIMBA, which is led by Antonio Santonio, who is actually keen on looking at the modifier genes. And so we can bring them together to create the team who will take together the functional and in silico data with the classical genetic segregation and co-occurrence, which is a bit of a double-edged sword. But for those of you not familiar with this idea, so basically if you have a condition where it is expected to be lethal if you lose both copies of the gene, then if you have someone with a known variant who then is found to have a variant on the, in trans, then almost certainly the other variant is not pathogenic, otherwise you'd be dead. And so it's actually quite a useful single patient piece of powerful information that we can use. And of course the other key point here is the national databases. Britain has just as much data as France. We just haven't told anybody. So we created a thing called DMU-DB, but because of all that silo problem that we heard about from Ewan, we can't yet get that data into the common public domain, but we will very soon achieve that. But as you all are aware, almost every day we hear of yet another data breach that people get nervous about, and so we really have to be very careful. And we made a bit of a slip with an organisation called care.data in Britain, where we were sharing data in the NHS between general practice records, and it's caused a huge backlash because people were nervous it was going to be sold to the private sector or somehow used to their disadvantage. So we must not lose sight of the importance of keeping the whole public on board and the advocacy groups with us. And that leads me to this graph, which is basically the boring PowerPoint slide, but the important point that we need organisation within this. On the right, we have ERA, the Ethics, Regulatory and Advocacy Subcommittee, which at the moment Stephen and I are sort of chairing, but actually Bartha Knoppers in particular will be taking the prime lead here, because this doesn't have much separating it from the Ethics and Regulatory Committee of GA4GH itself. So we'll probably run that alongside it. And we'll be having whole sessions in Paris devoted entirely to this topic. But on the left, what will feel more familiar to this audience, so we've got DCIS. DCIS is, for all pathologists who work in breast cancer, the DRAG, which is the sort of not quite breast cancer diagnosis. So we thought it was a good name for a committee. But in this case, it means Data Collection and Interpretation Subcommittee. And we basically have divided up into three groups with their chairs beneath there. First of all, we've got in the centre, in fact, the legacy data. We've been doing this for 20 years. And although in America, of course, all the data was largely generated by Myriad, who at the moment still haven't decided to fully share their data, but I'm hopeful that they will. Whereas here in Europe, the patent was overturned quite a long time ago or ignored as it was in the NHS. So in fact, we've got 20 years worth of data on this side of the water, with the advantage of being able to track it through patients' records. So the classified variants that already exist, the legacy data must be captured and retained. On the left, however, we've got the huge resources of the Broad, of the Sanger, the 100,000 Genomes Project, the Saudi 100,000 Genomes Project. The numbers just keep growing and growing. And so what David Hausler and colleagues are pulling together, and Gunnar Rasch and Antonis are actually chairing this, is an API that can walk into your genomes and your exomes and just pull out the whole sequence of BRCA1 and BRCA2. Because until 2010, we really had no evidence, no information on what was out there in the general population. We were only looking at people with a family history. And what Naz Rahman has just demonstrated and presented over the weekend at our workshop in the European Society was when she went and looked at the 1959 birth cohort and just looked at these two genes in almost 1,000 people, what she found was, first of all, 4 of them had a pathogenic variant. 1 in 250 people is walking around with a pathogenic variant in one of these genes. That's a lot of people. You know, you might think, well, we shouldn't test everybody, should we? And yet, if I was to point out to you that one of the chairs in this room has been mined with a small explosive device, and it will kill the person sitting on that seat sometime in the next half hour. The good news is there's only about a 1 in 500 chance it's going to be you. So you know, you're okay. You can all stay sitting on the seats. You're fine. The truth is that once people become aware of this, they're going to want to be tested. Because, you know, even 1 in 250 risk sounds a bit scary, especially if you've lost a family member from breast cancer. So we need to pull the evidence together to be able to interpret what this data means. And on the right, that's the interpretation committee, which is based on the InSight model, a multidisciplinary team getting together on a monthly teleconference to talk about the problems. And I'm going to end with this problem, just to illustrate why we have to do this. This is Christine and Kathleen, who very kindly agreed to allow me to use their picture. They are sisters, and Christine on the right had breast cancer at 42. She had a BRCA test. It said she had a valine at 1736 to alanine. and that is a highly conserved amino acid, but was listed in the literature from a 2007 analysis of the myriad data as not pathogenic. And so, in fact, then Kathleen came back to see me, or see our team, and the counsellor said, what should I say? It says it's a VUS. I said, well, it's still a VUS. Let's look on the literature. So we got Google out in the corridor, and there's all these papers saying that this is a functionally significant variant, but still it's classified as a category 3 variant of uncertain significance. I had the advantage that I knew Sean Taftigian very well, so I contacted him. I said, hey, Sean, what do you make of this one? And a message came straight back saying, it's pathogenic. And the reason it's pathogenic, and so meanwhile, we went to Glasgow last weekend, and I've started contacting colleagues around the country saying, has anybody got this mutation? And in fact, our family is also known to Glasgow, because this is my 2 sisters on the right here. Their cousin over there had breast cancer at 44 and a peritoneal cancer, which she's currently being treated for. And they think it's a category 3 variant. Meanwhile, up there in Canada, the person who got these tests done was their aunt who had breast cancer at 29, and she doesn't have this variant. So the people in Canada think this is not a BRCA family at all. So what's going on? Well, the story is that the original single patient from the myriad database that got this knocked off the list was a co-occurrence. But it turned out when Susan Domchek and colleagues went back and found that woman, she developed ovarian cancer in her 20s, and she was nearly killed by the medication. She was short stature, she was microcephalic. She had what we would call Fanconi's anemia. She actually had 2 pathogenic variants. And in fact, when you looked at her family tree, there was very obviously breast ovarian cancer running down both sides. So this is a pathogenic variant, but was knocked off the list. Because when you actually look at the probability calculation that we use for the variants, and thanks to my son and wife for this picture, that we had this co-occurrence, which in the Bayesian calculation gives you a 10,000 to 1 against it being pathogenic, because it couldn't possibly be survivable in the presence of another pathogenic variant. Earlier this year, a second case of this now called Fanconi anemia S has been described. So the answer is occasionally you can survive. So in fact, that was wrong. And when you just look at the segregation data, never mind the fact that 18 species has a valine to alanine at 1736, everything says this is pathogenic. And so the problem now is all over Britain, we've got some people being told that it is and some people told that it's not. So I did something naughty. I actually wrote through my clinical colleagues to every molecular lab saying, pretending to be the daughter of one of those 2 sisters to see what everyone would say. And so up in Glasgow, they said, well, we looked at this last year, it's still a 3, but we're a bit worried about it, we're thinking it might be a 4. Meanwhile, down in Southampton, they said, well, this has been on BIC 18 times, and look at this, it's been in DMU-DB 13 times, apart from the one that they'd seen. This is completely invisible to the rest of the world, by the way. And in fact, guys think it might be pathogenic because of mutation taster. Meanwhile, in Cambridge, Eamon Mayer wrote straight back and said, Mark Tiskovich was an author on the paper, we know it's pathogenic. And similarly in Manchester, they'd done a big workup and they'd realised it too. But the point is, I could have been sending this family to all of these labs, and they're going to get different opinions. I had 4 conflicting opinions within a week for the same family in our same country. So you see the problem that we face. Altogether, those scientists spent about 8 hours. I actually rewarded them with a free trip to Glasgow for their pains. But they spent 8 hours answering the same question wrongly. That we have not got the manpower to be able to devote to everyone working this up from the base again and looking up the literature. There's got to be a reference database we can rely on. But the final thing to say is that this is just about probability. Is it or is it not pathogenic? We have virtually no idea what the penetrance is of all these variants. So this variant is thought to me may be a hypomorphic variant, although in fact I don't think it is. I think it's hypomorphic in terms of lethality, but not in terms of cancer, certainly not looking at the families. But the problem is these families are all retrospective families. What we need is prospective data, and that's going to give us the penetrance. And so I'm going to end with this slide, Martin. Sorry, I've run out of time. So this is very exciting. It's called the Hippisley-Cox Open Pseudonymizer, and what we're going to do in the NHS through Gem Rashbas is actually apply these 256 variant bits of data to people's NHS number, which means that we can pull all of their medical records and their molecular data into a common place without breaching their confidentiality. And I haven't time to talk to you about this, and if I could, I probably don't understand it anyway, but the key point is we can use our Public Health England capacity to build a hereditary predisposition database to go alongside our cancer registry. So I'll leave you with this slide. BRCA is a perfect target because it captures the world imagination, but it's also a challenge because of this huge legacy. And I haven't even touched on the fact of all the commercial data. So at European Society, my risk is now, I think, up to 94 genes, about 87 of which we have no idea what they mean. Basically, there's now an arms race in the commercial sector to do ever more genes that we don't really understand. So we've got the disease variants at one side, and the analogy here is that all American tourists go to Princes Street in Edinburgh. But actually, my grandchildren grew up looking at this part of Scotland. Most of Scotland looks like the thing on the right, not like the thing on the left. And so most of the genome actually looks like the right. And in fact, what we really need to do is populate our databases from a genomic point of view using those APIs of pooled data. But then we must not lose sight of the fact that we need the disease variants on the other side in order to give meaning to that data, in order that we can dare to start doing surgery on patients on the strength of it. So it does have to be both wheels of the bicycle to make it go. Thank you for your attention.
Excellent, John. Never failed to get a great set of slides out of you. Questions? Questions or comments? This is the real world of clinical medicine.
Do you want to shout your question? I'll repeat it.
Yeah. How are you harnessing the power of the patient association?
Hang on, can I
How are we harnessing the power of the patient advocacy groups?
Yeah, around BRCA. They're all over the US and all over.
Yeah, absolutely. So the answer is we haven't yet started to harness it effectively, but that's one of our primary missions over the next 12 months. So really we want to do two things. One is to actually pull together the data that's already out there and extract it from the likes of DMU-DB, because there are literally tens of thousands of pathogenic variants already known to us. And the second is to engage with that public advocacy community. We're already in contact with the team looking after Angelina Jolie. We hope that she will come on board and help us draw in that community, because she is very supportive of this initiative. She is aware of it. And so we're expecting that the advocacy groups will come together and support this and drive us through that barrier that we heard about earlier about data being protected. But we aren't there yet. But we're welcome. They'll all be welcome, anyone that you want to send in our direction.
Richard, there's a microphone just behind you, and
just behind you, right behind you, literally behind you.
Thank you. What's Myriad going to do and why, do you think?
Okay, so we are talking to Myriad, and the answer is I hope they're going to join the party. Because I think that the benefit to them of getting out of this sort of separate place and joining the rest of the world community would be huge. However, having said that, one shouldn't lose sight of the fact that in Europe and across the rest of the world, there is a vast amount of data. So if they choose to remain separate, it doesn't prevent us from creating a clinically useful database. David?
Well, John, thank you for, it was a great talk, other than the first slide. No, I'm just kidding. First of all, you've given, Ewan asked the right question in his talk, why need to federate? And I think you've given a wonderful illustration of why, because your last example, the patient, the people who might be the prismatic cases may be from in Canada or in Scotland or wherever they may be, and also there'll be those other genes. The question for you is, how do you envision the average doctor will access this information 5 years from now? In other words, let's look forward and imagine this has been to the phone, but maybe something between the entry device, the sort of device in your hand. How do you imagine that there'll be a database or an API that has the 94 genes or the whole genome, and that the physician will say the patient's in front of me and get some integrated breast cancer risk score? Or do you imagine there'll still be the genetic counselor and the geneticist?
Okay, yeah,
how do you imagine it will actually happen?
Well, so thank you. It's a very important point. And so some of my clinical colleagues, and particularly in the genetic counselling community, are very anxious that we're sidestepping the critical point here of needing counselling. I think the answer is, first of all, we had a debate on this at the British Society for Genetic Medicine last year, which I was defending letting it go, according to Frozen and Disney, and I actually deployed my granddaughter singing that, which was a very effective device. But the point is, I think we've got to let it go, because there are too many patients out there. I said 1 in 250 of the population carries one of these variants. There just simply aren't enough counsellors and geneticists to stand in the way. But what we need to separate is diagnosis from prediction. Because I think when you move from the patient in the bed with ovarian cancer, and Naz and the team in London at the Marsden have demonstrated, 99+% of women with ovarian cancer want to know if they've got a BRCA1 or a BRCA2 mutation because it directs their treatment. But then when you start talking to their siblings and their families, that's where the genetic counsellors need to kick in. So I think there'll be a different referral pattern, but we need more counsellors. I'm not saying that we don't need them, it's just that they shouldn't be acting as a sort of gatekeeper. That gatekeeper function was born out of the fact this is an expensive test. Clinically, it just costs the hospital a lot of money. Once it gets cheap, you can't do that, you can't stop it. So in terms of access, what I want is a database on my phone next year, so I can go to an app and say which pathogenic variants are known. So when I next meet a counsellor in the corridor saying, what do you think of this? I could have looked up that variant and got a curated response. So I know that Mandy and Naz and all the other experts in the world have decided that this one is pathogenic. And to be honest, as a busy clinician, that's all I need to know. I don't want to have to think about it for more than 10 seconds. And if we can get to that point for these 2 genes, then next stop is 20,000 genes.
John, thank you very much indeed. Spectacular. The day will get even better now.